Hello tonight. I'm I'm just preparing for a week of midnight, so I'm trying to stay up. And I was gonna make a video tonight about, of all things, my views on how Canada should handle gun violence. And before I did that, I went to do a little bit of research on violence and civil disordinance and that in Canada, and had a pretty eye-opening experience. And so what I've done is I have made a little list today, and I know I have missed some situations that have taken place, particularly recent ones. So if anyone knows of any situations that I missed, please feel free to add them. But I made a list of incidences of systemic discrimination when they started, incidences of mass killings, and both using guns and not guns, and incidences where protests turned into riots and turned violent, not necessarily having any deaths, but police intervention was needed. I included the wars, and I also included acts that have been considered to be acts of terrorism that have taken place going back as far as 1867, the founding of Canada. And I found some just little interesting observations about the times and different brackets of time. And I figured I'd share them with you because it was interesting, instead of doing the gun control video, which I still plan on doing. This one's going to be boring. I'm just going to be reading off a list. But in 1867, that is obviously when Canada was formed. Then in 1868, Canada had our first assassination, which was Thomas D'Arcy McGee got assassinated. They're not sure exactly who did it. Someone was convicted, but they do know that it was from an Irish group called the Fenians. And in next event takes place in 1873. That was when a bunch of traders and trappers slaughtered 23 members of an Assiniboine tribe in Cypress Hill, Saskatchewan. Then in 1875, there were the Jubilee riots, where during the Pope's Jubilee, the Protestants and the Catholics basically had a smash fest. And then in 1880, it was a busy year. You had the Black Donnelly Massacre. You had Senator George Brown. He was assassinated, although that was only really deemed an assassination because he was a senator. He was actually just murdered by a pissed off former employee. And 1880 was also the year that the residential school program began, and that ran all the way up to the 1960s. And then when it was canceled, it was immediately replaced with what was called the 60s Scoop, which instead of residential schools, basically CAS took all the native kids away anyways and put them in foster care. And even today, there's a disproportionately high amount of indigenous youth that get taken away from their families, and that started the residential schools in 1880. Then in 1885, the Chinese Immigration Act was founded, and also at Frog Lake, Cree warriors slaughtered a British settlement. Then in 1907, there were the anti-Asian riots, And then shortly after that, in 1914, between 1914 to 1918, World War I broke out, and things were obviously quiet in Canada during that time. But in that gap, that little bit between Confederation and World War I was about a 50-year time, and there was basically a lot of racial hate and political hatred, assassinations. We systemically wanted to, well, we basically made it harder for a Chinese person to get into Canada than it is for a criminal to legally purchase a gun in Canada today. And there was a lot of it had to do with relations between cross-cultural, between white man and natives. And then World War I came around between 1914 and 1918, and then in 1918 we had the general strike in Vancouver. In 1919 we had the general strike in Winnipeg. Then in 1923 the Chinese Exclusion Act came in, which lasted until 1947. That just didn't make it hard for Chinese people to get into Canada. That just outright banned Chinese entry to Canada for 24 years. Then in 1931, an event known as Black Tuesday, the Estevan riots, it was a minor strike. In 1933, they had the Christie Pitts riot, which was a riot started by a white supremacist protest. Then in 1935, you had the Regina Labor Riot, and also you had the Ballantine Pier riots, which was a riot that started from a dock worker strike in Vancouver. And in 1938, prior to World War II starting, you had what was known as Bloody Sunday in Vancouver, and that was when a communist and socialist protest got shut down. They don't mention that one too much. And so basically everything that happened in Canada between World War I and World War II, aside from the Chinese Exclusion Act being implemented and the white supremacist riot at the Christie Pitts riot in Toronto, everything else had to do with labor relations. Every other one had to do with labor striking to try and get better pay and or better treatment, and then the government and enforcement shutting them down. And then that led us into World War II, which ran from 39 to 45. And during World War II in 1941, Canada began to intern Japanese Canadians, and that lasted until 1947. And then after the war, in the early 50s, two different elements of the government systemically dismantling certain classes of society. Sometime in the early 50s, the Rainbow Purge began, and that lasted until the late 80s. That was when the government systemically removed all persons of the LGBTQ community out of government positions and out of the military. They were just discharged and moved out. And that was also when they began to wiretap and remove people who showed communist or socialist leanings from all government positions that they could as well. And that lasted well into the 60s. And that all started in the early 50s. Then in 1955, this is where stuff starts to get crazy in Quebec. In 1955, you had the Rocket Richard riots in Montreal. And then in 1963, the FLQ bombed the Montreal Army Recruitment Center. in 69, the FLQ bombed the Montreal Stock Exchange, and they also bombed the a Liberal Party social club, and there were the Murray Hill riots, which was when the Montreal police force went on strike, probably because there were lots of bombs going off. And then outside of Quebec, also in 69, you had a mass murder. I believe this was done by an axe of a family in Buffalo Narrows, Saskatchewan. And then coming into the 70s, you had the FLQ bomb the headquarters of the Department of National Defense, and then you had the October crisis, which was obviously when the FLQ kidnapped and murdered the Quebec Provincial Minister of Labour. And after that, in 71, there were the Gastown riots. They were in Vancouver. They were basically pot riots. And then in 72, this was just mass killing took place at the Bluebird nightclub. The people got kicked out of the club and they set the place on fire, and 37 people died. And then in 1975, Canada saw its first two school shootings, one at St. Pius High School in Ottawa and one at Centennial Secondary School in Brampton, both in Ontario. And but that period post World War II was basically characterized by nationalist versus federalist versus separatist ideology in Quebec. Like, most of the crazy stuff was in Quebec. And then in 75, the school shootings happened. And this is where I think things start getting interesting. Because in the late 70s, early 80s was when we kind of flipped our economic system upside down. And in the first 113 years of our existence, from 1867 to 1980s, I just listed 34 events there. In the 40 years since then, since 1980, since the Mulroney government joined in the bandwagon of trying to promote globalization and trickle-down economics into Canada, and using foreign countries to make the supply chain cheaper to bring cheaper goods to Canada. Like I said, it gets interesting. Since in the first 113 years, there were 34 events. Since the introduction of this new economic system that we've been dealing with for the past 40 years, there have been 42 events. And this is where they start getting really random. Up until here, everything kind of had some sort of theme to it. You had labor strikes during the Great Depression, and you had discrimination against socialism and gays after the war. Some things were kind of explainable, but here is where things get nutty, and it starts in 1982. A group known as the Squamish Five bombed a guidance system factory in Toronto. They made guidance systems for weapons. In 1985, Lennoxville, Quebec saw a mass killing in a biker war. 1989, École Polytechnique had their shootings, which left 15 women dead. And 1990, there was the Oka crisis over land rights. 1992, saw a Toronto abortion clinic get bombed, saw shootings at Concordia University, and saw a Yellowknife gold mine get bombed during a worker strike. Then in 1993, they had the Montreal Stanley Cup riot. Then in 1994, you had the Vancouver Cup riot. Again, these are just people going crazy, riots over sports teams. And in 94, you also had a Vancouver abortion doctor get shot. And then in 95, you had the Gustafson Lake standoff over land rights. You had the Ipperwash standoff over land rights. You had a doctor from Ancaster, Ontario, an abortion doctor, got shot. In 1996, you had in Vernon, BC, an estranged husband killed himself and his entire family. In 1997, a Winnipeg abortion doctor got shot, and Weibo Ludwig, good documentary called Weibo's War on this, began the pipeline bombings that he would ended up being convicted for. In 1999, Taber, Alberta had a school shooting. Entering into 2000s, the FLQ picked up again, and they bombed a church that was conducting pro-English fundraisers. 2001, the FLQ firebombed 3 Second Cups and 7 McDonald's over English language usage. In 2006, there was the standoff in Caledonia, land dispute. And in Shedden, Ontario, there was a gang war, not even 2 gangs, just one gang fought amongst themselves and killed 8 people. And there was also a murder-suicide in Dawson College in Montreal. 2008, an act of enviroterrorism. In Dawson's Creek, natural gas pipelines were bombed again. 2009 saw a Vancouver gang war. In 2011, Vancouver rioted over another cup. And you also saw a shooting, the Claresholm shooting in Alberta, which saw an ex-boyfriend get angry and kill his ex-girlfriend and 2 traveling companions and then himself. And in 2012, arson was used to attempt to assassinate the new Quebec premier. There was the Danzig Street shooting, which was a gang-related shooting in Danzig Street in Toronto. There was also a policeman killed in a robbery, which was terrorist-related, at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. And there were also, although no one was injured, massive student protests in 2012. Then in 2014, all acts of terrorism. Canadian Forces member were ran down by a car. There was the Nathan Cirillo incident, the shooting on Capitol Hill. And a Moncton gunman killed RCMP members out in New Brunswick. And also in 2014 was the year the guy in Edmonton killed himself and 8 of his family members. Then in 2016, the school shooting in La Loche, Saskatchewan took place. 2017, in an act of terrorism, there was a stabbing attack on a policeman outside a Commonwealth Stadium. And then there was also the incident in Quebec where, on the anti-Muslim side of things, shot up a mosque in Quebec. Then in 2018, you had the Toronto van attack, which left 10 people dead, and you had the Danforth shootings. 29 saw us have the Markham family massacre and suicide. And 2020, not only have we had the Nova Scotia shootings, but there was just a woman randomly killed with a hammer, and the person who did it said they did it to encourage Islamic terror. And I know I have missed several of the more recent ones, but that is quite the list. That's why I made that status earlier about the history of Canada. Fight with fight with each other, get together long enough to fight the Germans, then start fighting again. And because it's just been one giant conflict, and the amount of incidences, I realize there's a lot of reasons for that, and a lot of it has to do with reporting and availability of information, but the acceleration of the amount of crazy stuff that has been going on in the last 40 years is unreal, and it seems to be accelerating to, if not a yearly, a multi-year basis now. And I just wanted to share all that info with you. I thought it was kind of interesting, depressing, but interesting. So that is a history of violence and oppression in Canada. Try and have a good night now. Thanks. Stay safe.